All right. Got my man Eyone Williams, man, aka DC Blacks. What's up with you, man?
Prime quality. What's up? What's up? What it do, man? Do I look comfortable?
Yeah, you chilling,
All right,
man.
let's go.
Chilling. I appreciate you pulling up, bro. Mean a lot, man.
Thank you for having me, man.
For sure. So, just kind of like talking about your background, man. You from DC, man, you from Northwest, right?
Yes, sir.
So talk
Uptown Northwest.
yeah, so talk about, your background in Northwest, like what it was like coming up.
Uh, to be honest with you, man, I came up like, regular young guys that came up in Northwest Washington, D.C., probably in the late 80s, early 90s, It wasn't about being tough or being a gangster or some of these other things that people kind of project now. I mean, even maybe myself, I may even be a little guilty, but for real, when I was growing up, in Northwest Washington, D.C., I fully didn't understand, or I didn't fully understand racism, poverty, some of the things that other guys from Washington, D.C. may attribute to their background. Uh, I would consider my background middle class, so middle class that I didn't think that we were poor. Uh, Public school system, sadly, I think that some of the upper Northwest school system were a little bit better than other school systems because as I got put out of certain schools and was able to go into schools further uptown, I learned that some of the educational things that led to sports or led to academics, they put a little effort into it. So I think that helped me in a way, and what I mean by help me in a way is that you're gonna see as we go further into it. I went to prison while I was in the ninth grade. It was really my second year. No, my bad. Let me say that over. I went to prison in the ninth grade, and I was in high school for 2 months. I don't know where they got second from. I was getting ready to say the second month, but I was in high school for 2 months before I unfortunately went to prison. And we can get into that later, but just coming up, I went to Whittier, that's a known elementary school. I went to Tacoma. I went to Rabault. I played football at Rabault Junior High School. That's a high school that's on 2nd and Peabody Northwest. I believe it's a charter school or something now. They changed the name, but the significance of it when I went there is pretty much all the guys that came out of my neighborhood that became neighborhood legends. A lot of them went to that junior high school. A lot of them went to Coolidge High School and Roosevelt High School. But I mention it because Rabault Junior High School, we won the first junior high school city championship, and a lot of people that remember me from sports before I even got caught up in the subculture or the streets, they remember me from sports, and that's pretty much the gist of growing up. I had a loving family, so to speak. My mother and father were teenagers, and they got caught up in the streets, and my father went to prison when I was very young, and my mother passed away, so my grandmother raised me. And that leads me into everything else, every other can of worms I opened up as a young child or as a young man.
How did being from Uptown kind of like shape you and who you ended up becoming as a person?
I think that's a good question. Nowadays, after I spent almost 2 decades in prison, you know, you have a lot of people use the term, when in Rome, do as the Romans do. I don't really like the full term because the Romans did a lot of things that I don't do. But just to use the term, right? An uptown guy, in my opinion, and you could cross-reference this with other guys, because I've seen you talk to a few guys that's a little older than me and been around longer than me, but an uptown guy, in tradition, is supposed to be smooth, quiet, fly, reasonable, and if need be, firm. So that's pretty much what I got from coming up uptown. The guys that I looked up to as a kid, not immediately. I'm talking about all the way up there when I was a child. I looked up to uncles of mine, men that was around my family, my father, of course my uncle. I would have to shout out people like Michael Salters or Wookie and Eddie Mathis, these guys that were legendary guys from the entire city. And I just had the fortune of seeing them around me because my grandmother's house was kind of like a house that those guys frequented. But I went to prison as a young man, and I picked up some other habits and skills just to survive. And I guess we could get into some of those things later, but the true uptown spirit, Monica, everything to go with it is what I just described. Smooth, get money, mind your business, stay out the way. And that's pretty much what I got from uptown.
How did, you talked about your dad being incarcerated. How did that affect you growing up?
One, I didn't have a father there, so I don't know some of those things that other people that had a father there to do, but one thing that really affected me was that I ended up being raised by women. And I love the women that raised me, and they gave me everything that I needed to push forward as far as like a whole deck of cards. You know what I'm saying? You ain't working with the whole deck. I think I was working with the whole deck as far as nourishment, love, education, all these things as a child. But not having a father there to be able to direct you into some of the manly decisions you make as you grow up. I made some of those decisions on my own, which is one thing that I know that was a product or a byproduct of not having my father there. Also, I had an older cousin that was raised in the house with me that was like a brother, who unfortunately didn't necessarily have a real father, but he had a father figure, right? So I guess at times when that person was gone, I learned certain things that your father should be able to teach you, correct you, or divert you from in the streets. So I ended up learning those things from older guys in my neighborhood that sadly didn't have fathers either. So not to get too deep into that, I think that's what I had. But nevertheless, I got to tap this part into there. I seen my father 3 or 4 times a week because Lorton Prison, which was the local prison for the guys from Washington, D.C., was open then. And some unfortunate guys that caught cases at that time, they went away to the federal system. But my father did his entire bid, which was 5 or 6 years in Lorton. So I make those excuses about not having my father at some of those critical times. But technically, as a child, I still was able to network, fellowship, and get wisdom from him. My father suffered from drug addiction, like most people that probably was in the streets at that time. I ain't gonna say like most people in the world, but a lot of people in the streets from D.C. in the 70s and the 80s, you know, heroin was a thing. Whether you were, you know, for lack of a better term, a dope fiend or a user, it didn't matter. So at my impressionable years, which I'm not really afraid to talk about because I talk about some of this in some of my books, my father, being as though that he had struggled with drug addiction at some point in time, it got a point in time where as though I was rebellious and I didn't listen to anything that he said. So to not be too long-winded with that, I think that I learned a lot that just because a person may not be able to practice some of the things that they preach or teach you, but I think you can learn from anybody, even a dummy.
So how did you get your introduction into like the street lifestyle?
I'm gonna tell you something. This is gonna seem funny, but you know, I guess you need some humor with seriousness too. But the movie Scarface was my first introduction into crime. Person gonna say, but let me explain why. I just mentioned people like Michael Salters, his name was Frey. I mentioned people like Eddie Mathis. I mentioned people like Greg Royster. These are Uptown street legends, DC legends. And sometimes as a child, your imagination runs wild. So I knew who they were because of whispers. I never seen them break the law. I never seen them sell drugs. I never seen them get money. I never seen them do the things that people allege that their legends are built on. But all the young guys that were my age, that were nephews and cousins of these guys that received perks like shopping sprees, going out to restaurants, Disney World, Disneyland, Myrtle Beach, we knew that these weren't the average people that we seen every day running to the bus stop with their uniform on. So as kids, we thought that they were somebody. Gold chains, Ferraris, Maseratis, Mercedes-Benz, beach houses, houses all over the city. I say all those things, all those are material things. Those are the things you see if you watch Miami Vice or Scarface or things like that. So I say Scarface because one of my uncles who turned out to be a legendary guy on the street, I don't know if you know what a Betamax is, but a Betamax was before VHS and before a DVD player. I thought I was kind of like, you know, a fortunate guy because one of my uncles, shout out to my Uncle Greg, gave me a Betamax, and we only had 2 tapes to go onto the Betamax in the 80s. We had Scarface and Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Those were the only movies, so I knew those movies by heart, which kind of goes into my creativity and my imagination because I became a writer later in life, but I really learned to love television and movies based on TV kind of raised us as kids. We went to school and we wanted to be fly, but when we came home, it was no adults in our household because all the adults that weren't criminals really worked 2 and 3 jobs. So I watched Scarface over and over and over again. I thought I knew what cocaine was, what bricks was, when you had to do something to somebody, what an informant was as a child. Fast forward, by the time I got to, I want to say like junior high school age, my cousin that lived in the house with me had a friend that was his age. They 3 years older than me. So when I'm 14, you know, they 17, 18, 19. And we had a mobile basketball court that you could move from the backyard to the front yard. And when the weather changed, I lived in front of Coolidge High School, which was let's say a popular kind of spot. It was a public swimming pool beside it that used to be open that is indoor now. But if you came and sat on my porch as a child, like the age that I'm telling you about, and that adolescent age that I'm discussing, because I'm getting into you saying, when did I first get into the streets? Well, for my cousin to be 3, 4 years older than me, he was high school age when I was junior high school age. If you sit on our porch, you see all the high school girls come out. You see all the guys that's a little bit older than the high school girls pull up in the cars. Back in the day, it was a Pathfinder, a Nissan Maxima, a Z, maybe a Benz, maybe a BMW. As a kid, I sat on that porch and I fantasized about when those times would come for me. You know, I fantasized about, damn, my uncle got this type of car, this type of jewelry, and these type of things. And my cousin's friend that was playing basketball on our patio with him dropped a bag out of his hoodie. And I thought it was a bunch of teeth. I was like, bro, somebody got their teeth knocked out in that bag? He hurried up and grabbed the bag and put it back in his shirt. So I was like asking my cousin, like, what is that? Make a long story short, it was crack rocks. And I'm real inquisitive. When I got my cousin back by myself, I was like, what was that Slim had? He said, oh man, that's crack. That's crack rocks. That's the stuff that they selling. And I said, yeah, so you know, you do this and you do that with that. And then he said, yeah, you do that with that. And I say, how do you get started? And for $50, you could get 5 of them. For $100, you could get 10, 20 rocks, and that's a wholesale. And like I told you, I was from Uptown. I didn't look at it like I was doing something immoral. I didn't look at it like you was selling drugs. I looked at it as an Uptown guy. I wanted to be able to do what they was doing because every day they had new Sergio Tacchini sweatsuits, they had new Fila sweatsuits, they had new tennis shoes, they had this, they had that, and that's how they was getting it. And that was my first curiosity of going into the streets. The streets for me was to get some paper. I never went into the streets for a name, a reputation, gang banging. I didn't even know that technically I was getting into breaking the law. You know what I mean? We all know that at that time in my childhood, the news and City Under Siege here and the crack epidemic was just coming on the scene. And that's how I kind of got into it. I followed in the footsteps of a cousin of mine that had a little bit more experience with people that was older. And some type of way, he discovered the hustle game, just like he discovered the fashion game. And I followed into his footsteps with that. The only thing I think I stepped out of his footsteps was when the violence hit. And that's another story. We can get into that later.